Our story tonight begins in the year 1977, which was an extraordinary year. Why? Because I was born in 1977. And so was the personal computer. Now, what that means is that I grew up in the 80s, so my childhood looked something like this. I think everybody, thinking back on the pop culture stuff of their childhood, on the movies and the TV shows and the comics and cartoons, the video games perhaps, of their childhood, everybody likes to think that their pop culture stuff was the best pop culture stuff ever. The difference between those people and me is that I'm right. Come on. Star Wars, Indiana Jones, Pee Wee Herman, the Transformers, The Simpsons started in the 80s. The music video was born in the 1980s. Michael Jackson's Thriller when I was a kid. Video games, the Nintendo Entertainment System in the 80s. It's as if the entire entertainment industry, advertising industry, marketing, computer technology, all of them got together and said, let's blow this kid's mind. And they threw these images at me constantly, probably more images than any kid had ever had to deal with before. Maybe, I'm not saying that the 70s weren't visually interesting if you liked avant-garde film. Not a lot of 8-year-olds do. I had to make sense of all of these crazy, colorful, fast-moving images. And I wasn't passive about it. I was the first kid, I was the member of a generation of the first kids who had some control over the images that we were bathed in all the time. I could flip the channel, and I could try to kind of find my own show. I could figure out that on the ads I could watch the parts of a show that I liked less than the one that I was mostly watching. I had very crude control over images, but I had some control. I could control these very simple video games at the time. And I just had to make sense of these images. I had to get literate in pictures and figure out, well, that's an ad, and Police Academy 3 isn't going to be as good as Police Academy 2 based on the trailer. I had to figure out my way through these images. So that's what my childhood looked like. It was very exciting. Here's what school looked like. No offense to teachers. There are some very nice-looking teachers here. But, seriously. But to a small kid who has been trained all day to parse constant imagery, exciting imagery, school was incredibly visually boring. It wasn't always boring to my ears. Sometimes it was very interesting to my ears. But if I tried to stare at the teacher, my mind would wander and I would daydream. So what did I do? I drew. I made my own pictures. Now, I didn't do this because I wasn't paying attention to the teacher. I did this so that I could focus my ears on what the teacher was saying. The teacher didn't see it that way. Teachers, at the time anyhow, assumed that if you weren't staring at them, even though they weren't really giving you much to look at, if you weren't staring at them, there's no way you could be paying attention. And so I had my notebooks confiscated, and I got sent to the corner, and I got sent to the principal's office. But it didn't stop me. When I outgrew the crude video games and the cartoon shows, I started reading comics. I think about that for a minute. I was a kid who saved all his money and waited all week to go to a comic store on New Comic Day and buy a stack of comics and go home and read them. I was obsessed with reading. And when I got to high school, I didn't give it up. I found that there were different kinds of comics that were geared towards older readers. Comics that would later get accolades like the Pulitzer Prize or reviews in the New York Review of Books. Comics like Understanding Comics by Scott McCloud, which is really like a semiotics textbook teaching you how to tell stories with pictures. Could you imagine that, a high school student choosing to spend his own money and his own spare time studying a textbook? Well, that's what I did. And I took these comics in to an English teacher who I very much respected, and I said, this is good stuff. You should read this. You should teach this stuff. You should let me do book reports on these comic books. You should let me do my book reports in the form of a comic book. And my English teacher looked at the comics, looked at me, and said, thanks very much, but these aren't real books. Maybe you should show them to your art teacher. So I took them to my art teacher. And I said, have a look at these. And my art teacher had a look at them and said, we teach you here about form and color and shape and perspective. These are really simple drawings. These are for little kids. They're cartoons. Why don't you take them home? I didn't take them home, though. I read them in class, and I got sent to the principal's office quite a bit. And when I was in the principal's office, I went into a friend of mine, a kid named Jacob. He didn't have the stubble at the time. If I was a comic book fan, Jacob Blackstock was a comic book fanatic. When we got out of high school, and I found that comics were really hard to draw, and I got into journalism instead, Jacob stuck with comics and cartoons. And he formed a career for himself as an animator and a character designer. And just a few years ago, he had an idea for a revolutionary new website that would let anyone make comics, regardless of whether they could draw or not. And a bunch of us put together some money and some work and some sweat and hours, and we made this website. We debuted it a couple of years ago. It's called Biscuits. Very briefly, like I said, it's a site that allows you to very quickly customize a cartoon character that looks like, you know, anything you want to. And once you have that cartoon character, you can get it to do all of the things that cartoon characters do. And since we launched this website, Biscuits.com, hundreds of thousands of people have used it to make millions of comics. Literally millions, that have been read by millions of people. But if you think about it, all of these millions of images that we've helped people produce, they're just a drop in the bucket. Because if you're a kid growing up now, what would your childhood look like? The stuff that I grew up with, it was baby stuff. The video games, they were incredibly crude. The cartoon shows that I watched, you watch them now, they seem so slow. Kids today, their entertainment moves at a lightning pace. And they walk around screens all day. They're inundated with more pictures, more visual material than any kids ever, probably in the history of the world. And they have to make sense of it. If you think that they are just sitting back and drooling, you haven't spent any time surfing the web with a kid. Adults read a web page, often left to right, up, down. Kids, their eyeballs scan all over. They know that the text in the red balloon means something different than the text in the yellow box. They can tell an ad from the relevant information that they're searching for. They are quick with images because they have to be. This is what a childhood looks like today. This is what school looks like today. Not all. Some schools have smart boards. Some schools have computer labs. We had computer labs when I was a kid too. But the meat and potatoes of a kid's education is still this. And as a result, a growing gap has occurred. Where I might have been one of the few kids in my class lucky enough to have a computer in the early 80s, now every kid is subjected to this stuff all day. And every kid is as bored or more bored visually in class as I was. And we're finding that there's a huge problem in traditional literacy, reading and writing. Kids are not doing as well as they used to. Across the board, in different countries, this is shown to be true. And educators are looking at comics, and they're researching comics and cartoons. I could have told them this a long time ago. A kid who doesn't want to read a book may want to read a comic book. And so some people are doing research and saying, you know, comics are a good way to get kids to read real books. It's a gateway to reading. And other people are saying, you know what, comics are a decent end unto themselves. It's okay for people to get visually literate for its own sake. And it feeds into digital literacy. And here in Ontario, our government, our Ministry of Education, realized that there was no one in the school system for whom this traditional literacy problem was more pronounced than young boys. And they identified comics as a great way to reach young boys, and they put out a call for software that would allow all kids in Ontario public schools to make their own comics. And so, we created Biscuits for Schools. Now, it just came out this past September, and right off the bat, we had the sense that something special was happening as soon as we unleashed it in the classrooms. Here's one classroom. Kids get to make themselves as cartoon characters, so does the teacher. And we saw that kids, younger than we thought, kids in grade 1 and 2, were able to make really simple comics. Kids a little bit older were making comics about complicated things like emotions and science, thermal energy. Kids even older than that were using the site to adapt Jane Austen novels or tell stories from Canadian history in French And I can tell you right now that about 7 months after we unleashed this into the school system, 60% of schools in Ontario are using Biscuits for schools. Sometime in the next couple of weeks, a student in Ontario will make the 1.5 millionth comic strip made in this province in 7 months. And we hear from teachers saying, what's going on? I have a student here who's a behavior problem, who had no interest in literacy, and they are engaging with this thing. They're writing about their lives, about their families. A teacher got in touch with us to say, I have an autistic student who I never knew had anything to say about anything until they got onto this piece of software. And the stories like that, they keep coming in, and in one of life's endless little ironies, these same schools that used to kick me out for reading comic books are inviting me back in. Because I brought comic books with the help of my partners back into schools. And they've asked me to come and explain what it is that we're doing right and how it is that we're able to reach these kids. I don't know. I've got a couple theories about it though, and I'll leave you with them. The first is simple and doesn't really have much to do with comics. That is that when you make a bit strip, that bit strip can be shared with your class by your teacher. And that makes all the difference. If a kid is engaged in the subject, even if a kid respects their teacher, kids want to communicate with other kids more than they want to communicate with their teacher. And the fact that they can share these comics with each other and comment on them, it engages them in the work, and it completely changes the dynamic of how they do the work. But there's another reason why I think our product has resounded so much with kids. And this is a bit of a bigger idea, that's what I'm going to leave you with today. If you think about it, we don't ask that you be a great novelist or a great poet before we teach you how to write. We don't ask that you be able to design your own font or that you become a master calligrapher before we allow you to write. We take it as almost a basic human right that to communicate in words is something that we do. Everybody, for the most utilitarian reasons, just to function as a citizen, should be able to use words to communicate. But with pictures, we're consumers. We have still all of these companies, all of this technology, just shoveling images into our brains. And to communicate with pictures, as opposed to being communicated to with pictures, that still is something that only a few elite people in our society, people who have the ability to draw well enough, drafting skills, to communicate with pictures, get to actually speak with pictures. And what we've done, along with a lot of other sites that are doing this in different ways, we've allowed kids to speak with pictures. It's not that surprising that they have a lot to say. Thank you very much.